Hello. Tomorrow will be the autumn equinox, which is an event of some degree of importance to a lot of types of pagan, not all of them, but a number of different types of pagan. Curiously enough, there isn't a great deal of mythology directly attached to the autumn equinox. There are other big festivals during the course of the year that have lots and lots of stories associated with them, things that are meant to have taken place at that time of year, but not the autumn equinox. However, that said, in France back in 1792, with the French Revolution taking place in that country, the autumn equinox was the time at which the monarchy, the French monarchy that is, were abolished. And France became a republic and remains a republic to this very day. There aren't a great many republican myths within paganism. I can't say as I'm particularly a Republican myself. Just the mere thought of President Blair or President Cameron is just too depressing for words. I'd sooner stick with the Queen and have either of those do. But there is a myth that I'm aware of that does link directly to republicanism, although it's not specifically associated with this time of year, which is an ancient Roman story. It's probably better described really as a legend rather than a myth, in that there's nothing particularly magical. There are no gods or spirits or anything involved. It's strictly a story of human beings. This is the tale of Lucretia. Long ago, over 2,500 years ago, Tarquin, king of the Latins, was waging war against the Rutuli, a tribe, a great powerful tribe, a nation state, some miles to the southeast of Rome. And as part of his manoeuvres to capture these people, to conquer their territory, to gain their wealth, to enslave their people and unite them with the burgeoning empire that was Rome, he sent his son Sextus to make an alliance with one of the aristocratic families of Rome. And off Sextus went, a young man who had been indulged all of his life. Never once had anyone said no to him for anything. As a child, as a teenager, as a young man, his every whim had been indulged. And so he went full of expectancy as to how things would go. And when he arrived at the house of Collatinus, with whom this alliance was to be forged, he was invited to a great meal, as was the done thing in that day and age. Collatinus invited all of his wealthy friends, that is to say, all of his wealthy male friends. For this was a political banquet, and the wives were not deemed to be suitable to attend such a weighty event. The wine flowed, there were dancing girls and dancing boys, there were poets reciting great epics, there were storytellers recounting the legends of gods and goddesses. There were entertainments aplenty, food aplenty, wine aplenty. And once the entertainments were over and done with, people fell to talking politics, but after that much wine and that much food, there's only so much politics you can talk on the first night of brokerage. The big discussions were for the next night. So once the enthusiasm for matters of state had petered out, the men fell to talking about their families, about the achievements of their children, about their marriages that they had forged for their daughters, about the successes and triumphs of their sons in politics or in the army or in whichever walk of life that they had gone into. And then they started to talk about their wives. And of course, each Roman husband wants to think that his wife is a vision of Roman modesty and dignity and gravitas. And each husband, being more than a little competitive as well as more than a little drunk, bragged that his wife surely was the more dignified, the more haughty, the more elegant, the more wise, the more genteel than the wives of the other men at the table. And a plot of sorts was hatched. The men decided, the seven of them, that They would go to the houses of each one in turn, secretly and quietly, or at least as quietly as drunk men ever imagine they are capable of being, and they would slip into the houses and see what their respective wives were getting up to find out, after touring all 7 houses, which wife was the most respectable. And so they went to the house of the first wife, the one who lived nearest. And she was making the most of her freedom from her husband. She had invited her female friends over, and they were necking as much wine as the men had been necking. They were eating as much food as the men had been eating. They had their own storytellers, their own jugglers, their own dancers, their own singers and poets to entertain them. And the husband in question was a little shocked and hoped that other wives would be even more outrageous in their behaviour, so that his wife would seem the more moderate by comparison. And they went to the house of the next, and the next, and the next, and each wife in turn was making the most of their hours away from their husband. Some with parties, some with lovers, some dancing wildly on the tables all by themselves, each up to something ever so slightly outre, until they came to the wife of the host, the wife of Lucius Collatinus. They came to the house of Lucretia, and she was not having a wild party. She was not entertaining strange gentlemen. She was not engaged in anything even remotely racy. When they snuck into the house, they found her sitting doing her embroidery along with her female slaves who were assisting her in this task. And it was all terribly genteel and terribly refined and terribly sedate, and in the minds of at least 6 of those husbands, terribly boring. But there she was, beautiful, genteel, charming. She saw the guests spying on her, and she recognised them and recognised her husband, obviously, and brought them all in and had them brought wine and more food, and sat down, and her husband rather sheepishly explained what they'd been doing, and he bragged to the other men about how his wife was the very best of wives, and she blushed to the roots to be so lauded in front of these other men, one of whom she had never met in her life. And he, Sextus, son of the king, well, he had always had something of a taste for purity, particularly in women. Young men as well, but women mostly. But not a taste for purity in the sense that you might admire purity or be inspired by purity or praise purity through poetry or art or song. His appetite for purity was corrupting it, ruining it, despoiling it, taking it away, breaking it, shattering it, leaving it in pieces. And the more he looked at this beautiful, dignified, gentle, witty, charming, clever woman whose modesty was echoing in her every gesture, the more he craved her. And the weighty matters of state which his father had sent him down to conduct, well, they diminished in importance by the minute as he looked at her. And at length, of course, the men had to take their leave of Lucretia and return to the house where all of the feasting and drinking was taking place, and where all of these big political negotiations were to be finalised in the coming days. And one by one the men reclined upon their couch, finished their amphora of wine, and passed out for the count, with the exception of Sextus, son of King Tarquin. For he, waiting until the other men were snoring deeply in their cups, slipped out of the house, past the gatekeepers, past the slaves, finding his way, ensuring that no one knew where he was going or what he was doing. And he arrived at the house of Lucretia, and just as he had snuck out of the house of his host, so he snuck in to the house of his soon-to-be victim. Past the servants, past the maids, past the sleeping doorkeepers, until he found his way in to the chamber, the sleeping chamber of Lucretia. And there he drew his knife and jabbed it into her throat, just enough to wake her up from the pain and discomfort. And there she saw him looming over her. And of course, With the moonlight streaming in, she recognised who he was, and he whispered to her, quietly enough not to wake up any of the servants who were asleep in the hallway outside the mistress's bedchamber, that if she dared to cry out or to summons help by any method whatsoever, he would murder her in her bed and then go and slit the throat of the large bodyguard who had been sleeping in the corridor outside. And when assistants came, he would tell them that he, son of the king, whose word was not to be second-guessed or gainsaid, he, son of the king, would testify that he had chanced upon this wanton trollop in bed with her servant, committing the vilest of sins with a slave, and had quite rightly, as the law permitted any man to do under such circumstances, killed both her and the slave. For him there would be no comeback. For her, dead though she was, disgrace would fall upon her children, would fall upon her family, would fall upon her husband, and she, as a shade in the afterlife, would have to live with that disgrace. And so, terrified into submission, a knife at her throat, digging deep, drawing a trail of blood down her bosom, he had his way with her time and time again during the night, enjoying the fear and the resistance that she put up to him. And at length, with the dawn light creeping in, he was sated. And he left her quaking with fear, and left upon her a deep wound as a reminder of what would happen to her if she dared open her mouth. And he was gone into the night. Lucretia's husband and father received a summons from her over their breakfast meals in their respective abodes, asking them to come to her abode, to the place where she lived, to the women's house, asking them to bring with them a friend each of high standing. And they came, the two men, and each bringing a guest, a friend. And they arrived, bewildered, to be summoned to Lucretia's house. There was nothing new. They frequently dined together, but the request to bring a friend was strange, and they wondered what on earth would be going on. And there the servant showed them into her chamber, and there she stood, ashen and pale and quaking, the cuts with congealing blood upon her neck, and she showed them the other wound upon her body, and recounted to them the horror of the night before, of how the king's son had broken into her chamber, of how he had violated her, of how he had done this terrible thing to her and threatened her with shame and indignity and all manner of unpleasant consequences. Threatened even her family, her husband, her children, with the indignity that he would heap upon them. And she begged them to seek vengeance for her good name. And even as the men were turning to each other in horror, in shock, in disgust, and wondering what methods they could take to avenge themselves upon the king's son, and through him upon the king, for he surely would come down in protection of Sextus, even as they spoke one to the other, she drew the dagger that was concealed in her long sleeve and rammed it into her heart and fell dead upon the floor. For the expectation in Rome was that any woman whose honour had been ripped from her in such a way should behave in such a fashion. In other parts of the world, in other times, it would have been different, but she was in that part of the world and in that time, and such was the burden of expectation upon her. Lucius wept over the body of his wife. Her father wept over the body of his daughter. The children gathered, the servants gathered, all gathered to weep over her, for she had been a kind and gentle and compassionate woman, and none had a bad word to say about her. And in that moment they swore vengeance, an oath of vengeance, to seek justice upon Sextus, to seek justice upon the king. The pact which Sextus had come to forge with them was shattered in that instant, before even the full, proper, heavy weight of discussion and debate had taken place, which it was due to that very evening. Word was taken out as the friends, the warriors, the soldiers, the hired mercenaries that these two men could lay hands to were summoned to the house of Lucretia. And of course, gossip being what gossip is, as people heard these messages being delivered, saw heavily armed men coming in significant number to the house of Lucretia, saw the funeral priests being summoned to the house of Lucretia, word eventually reached the ears of Sextus, who was lying upon his couch, just then waking up to a very, very late breakfast. And he realised that his number was up. He fled the city. Fled all of the way to an encampment of Roman soldiers, there expecting fully to be given shelter and security, but such was the character of Sextus that he had made enemy after enemy after enemy in his short life. And some of those enemies that he had made were in that Roman soldiery encampment. And far from a open-armed welcome, far from safety, Sextus found himself on the pointed end of a gladius and bled out his life and went to join the shades in the darker regions of the afterlife. And from that day forward, Lucius and his household fumed and plotted and warred against Tarquin and his household, until eventually, within a very short space of time, Tarquin was driven from the city of Rome by the council of elders who governed Rome, who were appalled and disgusted not only by the many terrible acts that Tarquin himself had performed in his time as the king of Rome, but by the story of the death of Lucretia and the shame that that brought upon the family of Tarquin. And as he fled the city, he sought safety and security in arms with one group of former enemies after another, seeking time and again to unite with people he had once warred against, to battle against Rome itself and defeat the very council who had thrown him from the city. But time and again he failed and he failed and he failed, and perhaps that is the will of the gods, that he should not have re-established his royal lineage over Rome. And from that time forward, for a very long time indeed, Rome remained a republic, freed from the yoke of tyrants, freed from the yoke of undeserving princes inheriting thrones. They became a republic. They did not always remain free of tyrants, unfortunately, but they did their best. And perhaps all of us, the world over, as we live in an age now, where we see the ever-increasing burden of tyrannical leaders and their extreme desires, might do well to take heed of the story of Lucretia and the actions of Lucius and his family, to throw off the yoke of those who would domineer us. Thank you.